Hi, welcome. I'm Chef Cassidy K, and this is Eat, Love, Garden. I'm a chef in Southern California, and I'm a cooking instructor at Lazy Acres Natural Market. I specialize in farm-to-table California cuisine, and today we're going to be making some Filipino dishes. So we're going to be making chicken adobo, we're going to be making a vegetable pancit using these fresh ingredients, and we're going to be making a ginger salad. So let's get started on the chicken. So chicken adobo is the national dish of the Philippines. It's actually a very simple recipe that can be applied to different types of meat. Today we're just going to be using some chicken quarters here. So we have the thighs and the drumsticks. But I've also done this recipe with chicken breasts, chicken thighs. You can use boneless pieces of chicken. You can also use other meats like pork or beef. So basically we're just going to marinate it in this bowl here. And the marinade is very simple. It's just a combination of some soy sauce. So we're going to use equal parts soy sauce and white vinegar. So I have about a cup of soy sauce here. But I kind of just eyeball it for this recipe. The most important thing to remember is to use equal parts. So just a 1-to-1 ratio of soy sauce and white vinegar. You can use rice vinegar if you prefer, but white vinegar works just fine. And then we have some peppercorns and some bay leaves in here. That's just gonna go right in. And then I use about a cup of sugar. So I'm using whole cane sugar for this recipe, but you can use whatever you have on hand. If you wanna cut back on the sugar a little bit, that's okay too. But just keep in mind that this is a marinade, so all the sugar isn't gonna be in the final dish, but it is going to help flavor the sauce quite a bit. And you just want to make sure that your chicken is fully covered with the marinade. So I'm going to set this here. The last thing that's going to go in is some onion and garlic. So I'll show you how I like to break down onions. This is a very simple thing you can do, is just cut off the ends. And then cut the onion right in half so that you can remove the skin easily. And then we're just going to slice this up. Again, it's just for the marinade, so it doesn't need to be any precise cuts. This is a bit of a small onion, so I'll probably use 2. So I recommend using 1 large onion, usually for the chicken, for about, I do this recipe with between 2 to 3 pounds of chicken typically. Okay, and then we're gonna break down some garlic, which is gonna go in as well. A good shortcut is you can buy the pre-shelled garlic, which I do often do, especially if I'm doing something like this for a big group of people, like a catered event. But if you have the time to work with the fresh garlic, that's always gonna give you the best result. So we'll just start by peeling away the bulb here. And a really simple way to take the skin off of the garlic, I know a lot of people have seen chefs will kind of break it down with a knife by pressing like this. But something I like to do, which I kind of figured out in my years of cooking, is you don't need a knife to do it, and it's a lot safer if you just put your hands over the garlic. Put a little bit of pressure into it, that way you're not going to risk cutting yourself while you're breaking it down. And then you can just throw the cloves in whole.
Give us a story about the adobo chicken. Why Why adobo chicken?
So I love adobo chicken, honestly, just because of the flavor, and I do find it that the preparation is pretty simple, and it's very versatile and flexible, like I said. So sometimes I have clients that are like on a little bit of a diet, and I'll use something like chicken breast. I'll cut back on the sugar a little bit, and I also won't serve as much of the sauce at the end. But I also find it great for large groups of people, which is actually like kind of the focal point of Filipino food. You kind of eat like bigger portions with Filipino food, and people are used to eating in bigger groups, like with their families and friends and things like that. So this is a great dish for it because since it's in kind of like a saucy type stew, it stays hot for a long time. So it's something that you can make in a big batch. You could put it in a chafing dish, for example, or you could even just leave it on the stove to stay hot, and it's gonna be good for hours that way without getting all kind of dried up. Okay, so we have about a bulb of garlic here and then again we have 2 small onions. We have about 2 to 3 pounds of chicken, and then about a cup each of white vinegar and soy sauce, and then we've got some peppercorns and bay leaves. So we're just gonna let this marinate for about 20 or 30 minutes. And while that's happening, we can start with our rice. So it's really important to serve adobo with rice because, like I said, the end result is gonna be very saucy. So you wanna have something to kind of soak up that liquid. But in general with Filipino food, rice is going to be served on the side either way, even if you're eating something like pancit. So we have our rice here, about a cup of rice, and we're just going to quickly rinse this in the sink. So the way I like to do this is just, you can use a whisk or your hand, and just kind of move it around like this. I'll sometimes like pick up the grains and squish it. And you can see here how the water is starting to get cloudy. So that's the starches rinsing off of the rice. You ideally want to get this away from the rice. Otherwise, when you cook it, it's going to clump together. And we're gonna need to do this a couple of times with a couple of different rounds of rice, but something I always like to tell my students is that this rice water actually has a lot of beneficial starches and nutrition. So you can use this for thickening up stews, you can use it for skincare or for your hair, but what I like to do is feed it to my plants. It's really gonna help, especially if you have any flowering plants or things like herbs. It's gonna help give it almost like a fertilizer and the nutrition it needs to grow. So I typically save all of my rice water and just water my plants that same day. So I'm gonna show you here as we have this plant of parsley. And since this is a pretty small plant, I'll just let that drain out. And I'll just toss the rest of the rice water. But it is good to know that it has other uses. So again, you just want to clean the rice a couple of rounds. I would say at least 3 rounds of fresh water, or until you start to see that the water is running a bit clear. So you can already see on this second go around, the water is running a bit more clear. So we'll just give it one more rinse. And you can see now the water is much more clear. So I'm gonna get rid of this water and then we should be good to cook the rice. So it is important to know, I recommend doing this in a separate bowl just because you don't want to be scratching your pans, or if you're using a rice cooker, they're typically non-stick, and moving the rice around can kind of scratch up that coating a little bit. Today we're just going to be using this pot. So we'll get all of the rice in here. Okay. So in general, the best thing to do, I'm using a short grain rice today. You can use whatever you want, but I would recommend just checking the package instructions for how much water. I know a lot of people struggle with making rice, and the best tips I always give are to, one, use a rice cooker, because that's kind of going to guarantee the best results in terms of timing. You can't really overcook it that way or undercook it because the rice cooker has sensors. But also check the amount of water you should be using for that type of rice, which should be on the back of the package of rice, because different types of rices require different amounts of water and cooking times. For me, I make rice almost every day, so I typically kind of eyeball how much water is going to go in here. For short grain rice, I just like to cover it by about, I would say, just less than ½ an inch of water. So I'm just gonna fill this up until it's completely submerged. But typically the ratio for cooking rice is 1 cup of rice to 1 cup of water. So that's something just to keep in mind. But if you do want to go without measuring, this is about how much water over the rice I will go. So you can see here, it's about, I would say, ½ an inch or less. So we're just gonna get this on the burner. So like I said, rice cooker is a very easy, foolproof way to do this. I definitely use a rice cooker if I'm cooking bigger amounts of rice, because you can kind of just set it off to the side and you don't have to worry about checking on it. But we're just gonna bring this up to a boil first. And then once it's boiling, I'm gonna cover it with a lid, or you can just use aluminum foil if you can't find a matching lid, and then turn it all the way down to a simmer. And then we're gonna cook that off for about 18 to 20 minutes. Again, that can differ depending on how well done you like your rice or the type of rice you're using. So we're gonna let this come up to a boil and then we'll be right back. Okay, so we got our rice up to a boil here, and then I just put the lid on and brought it down to a low simmer. So this is gonna cook off for about, my sweet spot for rice is usually 17 to 18 minutes for short grain, but you can cook it a little bit longer if you like your rice a little bit softer. And then we have our pan preheated here to start the chicken. So you wanna make sure your pan is hot first. I'll just put my hand over the pan to make sure that it's warm, so this is looking good. And then I have some avocado oil here, so just to make sure nothing sticks. You only need to use a little bit since this chicken's in a marinade. You don't want to have too much moisture in the pan. And then we're just gonna take our chicken, skin side down, and sear it in here. So you're gonna wanna work in batches. This kind of applies to when you're cooking any type of meat in a pan, but if I put all 5 pieces in here at once, it's not gonna have enough room to brown. And then again, it is important to do the skin side down first so that you can get that crust on the skin before flipping it over to the other side. So we're gonna start with this batch, pull it out, and then finish searing off the chicken in here. And then once that's done, we're gonna cook down the marinade in the pan. So we're gonna give this about 4 or 5 minutes just to really brown the skin, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we've got our chicken all browned here. Like I said, about 4 minutes per side is good. And then we're just gonna get this into the pan. And now we're just gonna pour the marinade directly into the pan. Sometimes I choose to cook the onions down a little bit before putting it in the pan, but they are gonna soften this way as well. So it's really up to you. If you feel like taking that extra step, it can be nice because the onions get really jammy. But typically what I'll do is just pour the marinade directly in. And then you'll also see here that a lot of the sugar kind of got stuck to the bowl, which is totally fine. And like I said, a lot of people are a little bit concerned about like how much sugar goes into the marinade, but that's why I always like to point out that it doesn't necessarily end up in the final product. It's just kind of to flavor everything. So we're just gonna bring this up to a gentle simmer. Anytime you put a lot of liquid in a pan, obviously the temperature is going to drop a bit. So at this point, you're going to need to play with the temperatures a little bit. I have this on like a medium high right now. But once it starts getting some bubbles, we don't want it going too crazy and boiling. What we're looking for is just kind of a gentle simmer. So lots of little bubbles going on. And then essentially the chicken is just going to braise in this liquid for about 20 or 30 minutes. So we'll give this a second to come up to a simmer and then we'll be right back. Okay, so we've got our chicken simmering here. Like I said, you don't want it crazy going like a boil, just some gentle bubbles here. And that's gonna simmer for about 20 or 30 minutes, just until the chicken is fully cooked through. In the meantime, we're gonna get started on our pancit. So this is a stir-fried noodle dish. Like I said, it's a Filipino dish. And I'm Filipino, and this is something that we eat a lot. Pretty much any gathering, any holiday, this is something that's on the birthday food table, weddings even. This is a dish I made for my uncle's wedding when he got married a couple of years ago, and it's something we have at Thanksgiving and Christmas as well. So definitely a really big staple food. You can make it a main dish with some meats, but I like to make it as a side dish with just vegetable and egg. So typically I like to start with some onions and carrots. Green beans are another common ingredient, and I love using mushrooms. But past that, I'll typically just use whatever vegetables I have on hand or any seasonal vegetables. Sometimes celery is included, but today I'm gonna be using cabbage, and I also found these nice runner beans, so we're gonna throw those in as well because that's a good spring ingredient. And then some red bell pepper. So I wanted to show you guys how to break this down. I like to just take the top off of a bell pepper first, and then anytime I'm chopping a lot of stuff, I like to keep a bowl nearby just to put the scraps in. So this way you're not kind of running to the trash can every time you have like your onion scraps and things like that. And I'll just pull the seeds out of the middle of the pepper, so this way it kind of keeps everything tidy. And you want to cut everything to roughly the same size. So basically the way this process is going to work is we're going to stir fry all of the vegetables first, and then we're going to take the cooked noodles and stir fry it all together. So you just want everything to kind of cook at the same time, which is why it's important to put things in roughly the same size. And then we have our vermicelli noodles here. So these are basically noodles that are made from rice or potato starch. You can find both kinds, either of them work. And you don't need to boil these like you would a wheat noodle. You can actually just put them, they're very thin and kind of malleable, so you can just soak them in some hot water. Okay, so these are our vermicelli noodles. They're basically noodles that are made from rice or potato starch. So you can find either one in the store, they both work. And since they're so thin and malleable, we don't need to boil them like you would need to with a wheat noodle. So I just have them soaking here in some hot water. And they're just gonna soak for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then we're gonna drain them and stir fry it with the rest of our vegetables. So I have this pan preheating. Again, I'm just gonna check the temperature with my hand and get some avocado oil in the pan. And then we're gonna start stir frying our vegetables in here. So we have the onion, carrots. Ooh. Have these green beans. We have our runner beans. I have some opo squash here, which is a little bit more difficult to find, but if you can find it in an Asian market, it's really great. And then some red bell pepper. So I'm gonna leave the cabbage till the end since it's gonna cook much more quickly. And I'm gonna save these oyster mushrooms till a little bit later too, since these vegetables are a lot firmer than the rest of that. You want everything to kind of be timed well in terms of the cooking. So I have my pan here on about a medium-high heat. We want to get some browning, so you definitely want to hear. I'm actually going to turn it up just to 8 out of 10. But depending on your stovetop, it could be a little bit different, especially if you're cooking with fire. But you do kind of want like a good sizzle here, and actually this is a great dish to make in a wok. So that way you can kind of get like browning on a lot of the sides. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of salt, just a little pinch, because we are going to be seasoning this with some soy sauce as well. But I find in Asian cooking, I kind of like the combination of salt and soy sauce, because I think salt still kind of provides something that just a flavor that soy sauce doesn't. But also whenever you're working with vegetables, the salt is going to help draw out the moisture and help things brown. So I do still like to use a little bit before adding the soy sauce. So we're gonna let that cook, and then while that's going, we're gonna prepare our ginger for this dish. So like I mentioned before, this is something that I eat a lot with my family. It's actually my grandpa that taught me the original recipe for this. And the recipe is a lot heavier on garlic, I would say, but I love ginger, and I prefer that kind of like bright and fresh flavor. I know like my uncle, for example, loves when I make it with a lot of ginger too. So I've kind of adapted like the more traditional recipe to use ginger instead of garlic, just because I find that garlic and ginger sort of compete a little bit when they're in the same dish. And ginger is a great ingredient to kind of have like in your repertoire anyway. There's tons of health benefits. It's very affordable. And it just provides a lot of great flavor. So one thing I find that a lot of students don't know is that you can actually use the skin. A lot of people are a little apprehensive with using ginger because, you know, it's a little bit harder to peel, and a lot of people are like, oh no, I don't want to go through that whole like peeling process. But the skin has tons of nutrition too. You just want to make sure to wash and scrub any dirt off before you get started with it. So what I like to do is just start by breaking it down into like long strips, and then I'll just roughly chop it. And at this point, you could throw this in a mortar and pestle or a food processor and blender and get it like into a paste. I actually like to use my cleaver a lot when working with ginger, since the weight is going to help you just kind of break it up. So I'll just roughly chop all over this. And I'm actually going to put a little bit of salt on here as well. So this is going to act as an abrasive to break it up even further and get more of the oils out of the ginger, get more of that flavor into our dish. And using the salt, you can use that technique with garlic as well if you're trying to get kind of like a garlic paste. Basically, the salt is just getting in between all the pieces and helping break it up. So for me, I think this size is about good. It really depends on your personal preferences. If you're new to working with ginger, it can have kind of a strong flavor, almost like spicy peppers. You might have to like build up a little bit of a tolerance to it. But for me, since I eat it so often, this is totally fine, and these like bigger chunks aren't gonna bother me so much. And occasionally I'll make dishes for things like curries, or even if I was just in a rush when I was making this, sometimes I'll just slice ginger thinly And you can throw it into the dish just like this. But again, it just is a little stemmy and you might want to choose to eat around it, but the flavor will still get into the dish this way. I'm gonna give our noodles a turn here. They're starting to get some nice color. And it's starting to stick to the pan a little bit. So at this point, what I like to do whenever I'm cooking vegetables in a pan, and it's starting to stick, is just introduce a little bit of moisture to the pan. You can do that with either water, but in this case, since we're working with soy sauce, I'm just going to introduce a little bit of soy sauce into the pan to kind of help deglaze and keep that from sticking. So that way I don't have to add more oil. And these vegetables look like they're about halfway cooked through. So at this point, I'm going to add our oyster mushrooms so those can start cooking down. Something important to note about mushrooms is that you don't want to put salt directly onto mushrooms before they're done cooking, because it's going to take the moisture out and they kind of shrivel up into nothing. And then you're also going to be left with like a lot of their juices in the pan. That can be okay in certain applications, like for example, if you were making a mushroom gravy or like a cream of mushroom soup, you would want to get that moisture out. But in general, whenever you're trying to brown mushrooms, I would recommend not adding salt until the very end. And I am just going to get a little bit more oil in the pan since we've added this new ingredient. Okay, so we'll let that cook off for a minute. Again, I'm going to hold the cabbage to the end. I'm going to hold this ginger until it's a little bit closer to being done because we don't want it to kind of burn. But in the meantime, we can check on our noodles here. Okay, so while that's browning, we can check on our noodles here, and you can just come in and feel. These are starting to get soft, could probably use a couple more minutes, but they are soft enough now to cut. So since these noodles are very long and stringy, it's a little bit difficult to stir fry when they're at this length. So what you want to do is just come in here with scissors and cut them up. And at this point, I always say Italians look away, but this is kind of like the proper technique for stir frying vermicelli noodles. And scissors can actually be really helpful in cutting up other things, like for example, scallions. It's really nice to use scissors to cut those up, or even if you're cutting things like chunks of meat. But you just want to get these down to, I would say, 2-inch pieces. So you can just cut them in the bowl like this. And we'll give that a couple more minutes just to get fully soft, and then we're going to drain it and then toss it right here in this pan. These noodles are looking pretty good, so at this point I'm just going to add another splash of soy sauce just to make sure nothing's sticking. And then I'm going to add in our cabbage here and all of our ginger. Okay, so I'm gonna go drain these noodles, and then like I said, we can just add that right in, so I'll be right back. Okay, so we've got our vermicelli noodles all drained here, and our vegetables are quite cooked through, so we're just gonna go ahead and add the noodles directly in the pan. And then just to keep things from sticking and to give it a little bit of flavor, I like to add some sesame oil. So just enough. You can think of this kind of like if you were cooking pasta, you would want to coat your noodles with a little bit of olive oil for flavor. So that's typically, I used about a tablespoon, maybe a little more, but it's going to give it some good flavor here. And then we just want to incorporate everything. And then So this dish, a lot of the flavor comes from this ingredient. This is oyster sauce. This is something that's really common in Filipino cooking. So again, just like with everything else today, you can add as much as you want or as little as you want, kind of to your own taste. This has kind of like a salty, sweet taste to it. So, you know, try it out. Start with a little bit and then add a little bit more over time to get it to your liking. It is very strong, so I like to just start with a little bit at a time. And you want the noodles to take on this brown color. So we want to avoid having any kind of like clear noodles here. Just make sure you incorporate the sauce into all of the noodles. And I still have my burner here on medium high. So we actually are cooking the noodles down a little bit longer. If you were doing a really big portion of this, like I said, you actually could just mix it all in a bowl, but it is ideal to kind of stir fry the noodles a little bit just to finish it off. So in here we have our oyster sauce, our sesame oil. We've already given the vegetables quite a bit of soy sauce, so I don't think we need to add any more, but you can kind of moderate that on your own. If it needs a little bit more saltiness, then you can add a splash of soy sauce. I think this is good for today. I'm just going to taste a little bit and make sure the noodles are seasoned to our liking. Okay, that's good. So what you're looking for is a good balance between like the salty and sweet. It's really important that there's enough salt in here. If you feel like just adding more soy sauce isn't really going to get you there, a little sprinkle of salt would be good. And then there's one more thing I forgot to mention is we're gonna add in these eggs here. So like I said, you can make this dish with meat. I like to just use eggs most of the time and serve it as a side dish. But you can just stir fry the eggs right in, kind of like if you were making fried rice. So I'm just gonna add the eggs in right there. I'll let them set a little bit so some of the whites are starting to cook, but then you can just scramble it just like this. You don't have to scramble it ahead of time. Of course you can if you were looking to get more of like a fluffy egg texture, but this is kind of a technique of just stir frying eggs. So you can sort of just push everything to the side here. I do the exact same thing when I'm making fried rice. And we want this to fully cook before we start to incorporate the rest of the noodles and vegetables in here. So we'll just give it another minute. Once this is fully cooked, I'm gonna turn the heat off completely since the noodles are fully cooked through before we combine everything. So while that sets a little bit longer, I'm just gonna season this with some pepper. And then we're gonna garnish with some scallions and some lemon, which I saved to the very end because if you cook it, the flavor is kind of gonna get lost. So another minute or so on these eggs. And then when you serve this, typically people like to serve some lemon wedges and some pepper on the side because some people want to add more pepper and lemon to their dish. But the lemon is really important in kind of balancing those like salty, sweet flavors in here. So you definitely want to make sure that you have that. Okay, so these eggs are fully cooked through. So now I'm just going to add everything into the pan. And like I said, I'm going to turn the heat off here. And just kind of combine everything together. So I recommend shrimp is really great for this. Chicken is okay, but my favorite thing to put in here if I am going to be cooking with meat is pork belly, because a lot of the fat will render off and kind of work its way into the noodles. So that's a really great option if you can find it. Again, it is like a little bit more of a difficult ingredient to find, but typically Asian markets will have it. Or sometimes if you go into your butcher at your grocery store and you don't see pork belly out, you might just ask them if they may have some in the back. So everything's mixed together, and like I said, we already tasted for seasoning, so I know it's okay there. And then I'm just gonna squeeze some lemon juice into my hand just to catch any seeds here. You can obviously use a lemon juicer if you have one, but this is really gonna bring the whole dish together. So this looks really good, and I think we're ready to plate, so we'll be right back. Okay, so little quick update. We've taken the chicken now out of the sauce, and we're just gonna let this sauce continue to cook for about 10 minutes. That way it can turn into like a nice thick syrup, and that's gonna be served over the chicken. And our rice is done, so I'm just leaving the lid on there so that it can steam a little bit. And now we're gonna work on our ginger dressing for our salad. So this is really simple. Like I said, everything is just gonna get thrown into a blender. So we have some onions here, some carrots, which is gonna give it a little bit of sweetness and a nice color, celery, and then I have about 2 inches of ginger here. So you can do less. Like I said, if you're new to eating ginger, it might be a little bit strong this way. But it's just a personal preference. And then this is going to get blended with just a little bit of tomato paste, about half a teaspoon here. A good pinch of salt. Just a little bit of sugar, which is going to help balance everything. A couple pinches of sugar. And then I have some soybean oil here, which has a really nice flavor. You can use avocado oil if you prefer, or canola oil or any neutral oil. You just want to avoid anything like olive oil because that flavor isn't going to mesh well with the rest of the Asian ingredients. And then I'm just going to give it a splash of soy sauce, about half a tablespoon. And then I'm going to give it a couple tablespoons of, this is rice vinegar. So typically whenever you're doing any kind of dressing, you just want to aim for a ratio of 3 parts fat to 1 part acid. So if you were just doing a basic vinaigrette, that could be 3 tablespoons of olive oil to 1 part lemon juice. But that ratio can be played with a little bit. So sometimes I like to follow more of like a 2-to-1 ratio if I want it a little bit more tangy and acidic. So I'm just going to check out the level of the oil here, and that way I can kind of tell how much I'm adding in. So I'm going to do more of like a 2-to-1 ratio for this dressing. So that should be good on the rice vinegar. White vinegar will also work if you don't have any rice vinegar on hand. And then we're just going to add a little bit of sesame oil, which is more for flavor. And then we have some white pepper here. I'm just gonna do a couple pinches of white pepper. You can use black pepper if you can't find it, but I really like the flavor of this white pepper. And then I'm just gonna blend this all up until everything's emulsified. So I'll be right back. Okay, so we have everything finished up here. Like I said, remove this chicken and let the sauce simmer for about 10 minutes, and it helps it thicken up a little bit. You can let it go even longer if you want it really thick, but this is good for today because you do want some sauce that's gonna get into the rice. So we're ready to plate everything. So I'll show you how I like to plate this pancit. And typically with Filipino food, everything is done family style. So I love to do these big platters. So I'm just gonna garnish this with some fresh scallion. You can use whatever you have on hand. Even cilantro would be nice, or if you don't have anything, don't worry about it. And then I like to serve some lemon wedges on the side, so that way people can add a little bit more lemon if they'd like. So this is the final pancit. And then here we have our ginger salad, our ginger dressing that got blended in the blender. Again, make sure you want to taste for seasoning before you serve this. Sometimes you might need to add a little bit more salt or sugar. So we have this here. And then typically for ginger salad, I'll just serve it with some iceberg and whatever ingredients I have on hand. So today we have some Kumano tomatoes, some carrots. Occasionally I'll add things like cucumbers or even sliced white onion is good. But I like to keep it pretty simple. And then unlike regular salads where you would want to toss the lettuce first, since this is such a heavy dressing, it's just going to sit right on top of the iceberg. And I'll typically just serve this to guests on the side too, so that way they can have a little more if they want. And then we're just gonna top this off with some black pepper. We have our rice here ready to go. So this is gonna get served on the side of the adobo. I have a couple more lemon wedges here. Sometimes I like to have tomatoes either fresh or baked in the oven on the side of a dish like this, because it'll balance out the heaviness of the chicken and the rice. And then we're ready to plate our adobo. So what you want to do is just spoon all of this sauce right over the top. And then we'll get these onions that are now nice and jammy from caramelizing in here too. There's some whole pieces of garlic. You're gonna wanna eat around the bay leaves, but I do like to keep it in just for looks. I think it looks really nice. But everything else in here you can eat. You can eat the whole garlic. The peppercorns are also edible because they've cooked down for so long that they're soft now. Some people may choose to eat around it, but I actually really like the flavor and how it ends up in this dish. So here's the final product of the chicken adobo. And that completes everything for today. So we have our adobo, our pancit, our ginger salad. I chose these because I think they go really well together. They're really great staples, especially like I said, if you are feeding bigger groups of people, they work really well together. It's gonna give you a lot of balance, like to have this nice salad with this heavier chicken dish. And then of course this pancit, which is always gonna be on the table when you're talking about Filipino food. So thank you so much for joining me today on Eat, Love, Garden. I'm your host, Chef Cassidy K. You can find out more about me on chefcassidyk.com or on Instagram at chefcassidyk. And thank you so much to my sponsor, Lazy Acres Natural Market. They're an organic grocery store in California. We have locations all up and down the coast of California, and we teach great cooking classes in there. So thank you guys so much for supporting my teaching career for years now. I'm so happy to be a teacher there. I love working there, and as a private chef, I love shopping there. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. I'm gonna sing one of my original songs, Cocoon, written with Clint Rowe. I can't catch my brain tonight. Smoke screen fills the room. Inside inside my apartment. I long for my cocoon in the room by the window where I sit. My cocoon, count the ways we started. Kaleidoscope of sweet demise, but I have no sweet tooth. In my dark world where belies the past once was exhumed. In the room, my cocoon, by the window where I sit. My cocoon, count the ways we started. A world of unexpecting eyes, can't you feel it too? On the brink of fatal fire, a future so consumed by my cocoon, by the bay, by the window where I lay. My cocoon, count the ways we started. Count the ways, oh, count the ways, count the ways we start.